Yeah, and now I got the message that it's being live streamed.
So good morning, good afternoon, hello everyone. It's great to be back, and we are continuing the activities of the first international colloquium on the metaphysics and semantics of fiction. Today with a talk by Professor Fredrik Haraldsen, who is an associate professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and he'll present the talk "Fiction as Possibilities." So, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, and thanks for having me. I mean, as some of you might know, I was really supposed to talk back in June, but unfortunately, due to an emergency, I had to cancel that one. And I apologize not only to the people arranging that that conference, but to everyone else who expected me to be there that I couldn't. Hopefully, I'll make it good again, or at least to some extent, by talking today. And of course, as everyone else talking about anything having to do with semantics or fiction these days, I guess I'll have to just note the passing of Sol Kripke a couple of days ago. I'm not going to call for a minute of silence or something, but obviously Kripke's significance for these kinds of topics is hard to measure. Final little thing I want to say as introducing myself here is I'm using the cover now for this PowerPoint, so the first slide. That's a picture that I was supposed to use back in June too. It's the cover image from an edition of Philip Pullman's The Subtle Knife from like the 70s or something. But I have to apologize. I do not remember what the point was that I was supposed to make by using this. So that's a mystery to me too. But I had some kind of point about the plot there and some of the things I'm going to talk about. But yeah, if I remember it, I'll tell you. So what I'm going to talk about today is possibilism and the use of possible worlds to give an account of truth in fiction. So the talk is based on ideas that I made in papers published a couple of years ago or over the last couple of years. And basically, I'm going to try to bring those ideas up again and put some more flesh on them and try to develop them a little bit further. But yeah, that's the basic idea. So possibilism about fiction is the view most associated with David Lewis, according to which fictional characters are possible objects, possibilia, and stories of fiction are possible sequences of events. So although Sherlock Holmes doesn't exist, he could have existed, and he does exist in some possible world different from the actual one. And the sentences that contain Holmes or that make up the Holmes story, we understand those sentences in part, at least, by grasping what things are like in the worlds relative to which those sentences are true, or at least in a manner of speaking. So, right. So to provide a fictionalist framework, I can first give you a definition of truth in fiction. In fiction F, the sentence S is true if and only if in the relevant possible worlds reflecting the story of F, S. This is not quite the definition that Lewis gives, and I'll come back to why I depart from Lewis a little bit later. But 2 points are at least worth making now, even at the very beginning. So by relevant, you can think closest. So in fiction F, S is true if and only if in the closest possible worlds reflecting F, S. I'm going to take up that kind of restriction later and talk more about closeness. The second, building on a point I remember Alberto Voltolini mentioning in his lecture. So the way that criterion is formulated, it assumes that an utterance of a sentence like Holmes is a detective is elliptical for in the fiction, Holmes is a detective. It is possible as an alternative to interpret such sentences as being non-elliptical, literally false, but rather understand fiction talk as engendering a shift in the context of assessment. So that would obviate the need for an operator. So basically, when I say Holmes is a detective, I don't really say in the fiction Holmes is a detective, but I'm uttering a sentence that's literally false, but can be evaluated as true at a possible world. Some people think that the operator in the fiction F is problematic when you interpret fiction. I'm not going to go further into that. It's a possibility if that's something you are worried about. Now, possibilism as a framework for understanding fiction has some obvious benefits. Possibilism predicts intuitively correct truth conditions for sentences containing names for fictional characters. But not only do they get the right truth conditions, they also intuitively get the correct truth values in a lot of cases. And much more consistently so, I believe, than other views, anti-realist views, or abstract artifact views, or Meinongian views. So, a sentence Holmes does not exist is true. There is no Holmes is true, insofar as existence descriptions involve implicit restriction to the actual world. So yeah, Holmes exists in some world, but it doesn't exist in the actual world. And when I say that Holmes doesn't exist, I am presumably talking about the actual world in which the sentence is true. Holmes is a detective, has both a true and a false reading, as we would have hoped, depending on the presence or scope of the in-fiction operator. Possibilism seems able to account for intertextual comparisons, embedded fictions. I'm going to talk more about that. And claims such as Holmes is a fictional character. No problems accounting for these things. If you want details, we can talk about that later. Possibilism also makes it easy to make sense of speculations about characters' motivations. And things like Holmes' psychology, his sexual orientation. That's also been, something that literary theorists have been taking up. Whether those are relevant, okay, but it makes sense to talk about it at least. It also gives us a nice basis for explaining how it's possible to learn from fiction, not only facts about the actual world that's recounted, but also things about the morality or the human condition or things like that. Because after all, the stories are supposed to reflect events in close possible worlds. So we can sort of use the fact that these are as real as possible to derive certain facts about the actual world from the stories. I have to admit that I'm very wary about this, but I guess I'm kind of more sympathetic to Plato and his view of fiction than a lot of people writing about fiction. I mean, sure, when I read a novel set in this World War II, I learn some facts about World War II. But when it comes to sort of these ideas about the human condition or stuff, I mean, how much do we really learn from reading War and Peace or Game of Thrones or what have you? I mean, if you read War and Peace and you conclude, yeah, no, this seems reasonable, this is how people would react, that I suspect is mostly because you import what you already know about people's psychology to interpret what goes on in the novel. I'm not sure you really learn a lot. You get some good examples, sure, and you might get some coloring to what you think about the human condition or existential issues. But beyond that, I have to admit that I'm skeptical. But possibilism does at least give you a kind of framework where learning about the human condition from reading works of fiction is possible. I should also mention that possibilism is, of course, usually thought to be a realist view about fictional characters. So there are really fictional characters, or I mean, it's tricky to formulate. In the actual world, they don't exist, but Holmes is, in fact, a flesh and blood possible object. He doesn't exist in the actual world, but he he is somewhere else in model space. To what extent I'm committed to that sort of realist view is something I need to say something about. But before I say something about that, I want to point out that possibilism, as I talk about it, could really denote two somewhat different projects. So on the one hand, you might want to use possible worlds to provide a semantic theory that assigns intuitively correct truth conditions to sentences. Like, Sherlock Holmes is such and such expresses a singular proposition, and it does so by referring to a non-actual character. So the proposition is then associated with a set of worlds in which that object exists and is a detective, perhaps. It's not a true proposition relative to the actual world, but it's meaningful because there are possible worlds. So you can provide a possible world semantics for fiction talk. That, of course, is very interesting and something I commit myself to. But there is a different but related project that you can also use possibilism to promote, and that's the one I'm going to focus on today. That's developing a model of fiction as a type of discourse, a theory of truth in fiction. These two projects are sort of closely tied, and for Lewis, they're sort of two sides of the same coin. But it's kind of important to distinguish between them, because I'm just going to assume a lot of semantic facts or semantic theory when I try to explain my idea about truth and fiction. And I'm not going to go into too much detail there, but I need to say something about the metaphysics and semantics of truth and fiction. Because I need sentences of fiction to express singular propositions. And in order for that to be the case, I need to make some moves, or at least make some assumptions. So I'm going to say a little bit about that. I also realized that the conference was supposed to be a conference on the semantics and metaphysics of fiction. So basically, I thought that I was going to skirt those big topics, but given that that's what the conference is about or supposed to be about, I should at least say a little bit about that. First, here's a tentative plan for the talk. Now, given that you don't have access to the PowerPoint downloaded, you can't sort of keep complete track. I'm going to say something about the assumptions and understanding issues now first. Then I'm going to sketch a possibilist model of truth and fiction and give a rough idea about how it's supposed to work. First, a model of a fictional a model of how fiction are built out of possible worlds. Well, that's vague. You'll see it when I get there. And then I'm going to give a sort of semi-formal definition of truth and fiction, and then I'm going to discuss the fun stuff, the interpretation issues. So some of the parts here are going to be somewhat formal, or at least touch on formal issues. If you find that uninteresting, you can still partake in the fun stuff toward the end. So initial assumptions that I'm just going to mention. Now I'm committed to possibilism here. So how metaphysically robust do I need worlds to be? David Lewis thinks that possible worlds are real spatiotemporally, they're spatiotemporally closed off from us, but they're real concrete objects. Do I need to commit myself to anything similar? In that case, that's metaphysically sort of ambitious commitment. I'm going to leave it a little bit open. Whether I do, I think, hinges on several issues that I'm not going to really go into here. But I'm going to talk as if I was a full-fledged modal realist. And then you can criticize me about that in the question session afterwards. Another thing I'm going to commit myself to, regardless of what we say about the first issue. In order to use possible worlds to model fiction, there must be worlds containing magic, ghosts, dragons, and people who wake up as beetles or cockroaches. And one of the reasons people might be doubtful about that is because, Kripke again, a commitment to essentialism. I am very doubtful of these essentialist claims. I mean, am I essentially a human? Am I a human in all worlds where I exist? Well, it seems to me eminently possible for me to turn into a rock or a tiger or what else. So I am very doubtful of those kinds of metaphysical necessities, like the essentiality of origin and so on. But people who have read a lot of Kripke are very often heavily committed to that. But I'll just note now that if you are committed to a proliferation of metaphysical necessities, essential properties, then it's going to be really hard to give a possible world interpretation of fictions like Kafka's Metamorphosis and so on. At least it would be a very inelegant model where you would have to do a lot of sort of ad hoc repair. So I'm just going to say that no, I reject all of those things, and I'll be perfectly willing to discuss that in the question session. That said, I do think that you can tell a coherent fiction about people getting turned into cockroaches and so on, is at least prima facie evidence that these events are possible. I mean, if imagination is no guide to possibility, then what is? I'm just going to leave that question out there. There is another option too, which should be put out. I said earlier that I was unsure how heavily committed I am to full-fledged modal realism. And that matters here too, because if I wasn't committed to a full-fledged modal realism a la Lewis, then I mean, if I could be an ersatzist or maybe a fictionalist about possible worlds, then there are other tools available to me, because then I could admit that, yeah, sure, it is an essential property of me that I'm a human, but it's not a logical truth about me that I'm a human. So basically, it seems, at least in theory, possible to distinguish logical possibility from metaphysical possibility, and then just say that, no, the worlds that are relevant for fiction are logically possible worlds. The fact that it's what's metaphysically possible, assumptions about that is something we can suspend when we create models for fiction. That's a move that might be available to me if I am not committed to full-fledged modal realism. But if I am committed to full-fledged modal realism, that is really hard to make that kind of move. I am going to assume that proper names are directly referential. As some of you know, that sits very uncomfortably with a Lewis counterpart theory of possible worlds. Arthur Sullivan, for instance, has argued that no, the counterpart theory requires descriptivism, and that also seems intuitively plausible. So I'm going to reject Lewisian counterpart theory. That, I think, is not really a problem. It's often assumed in literature that possibilism is committed to Lewisian counterparts, but I mean, if you read the Metaphysics of modality, there are a lot of good literature criticizing that kind of point. So Chris McDaniel has written very convincingly, in my view, how even a modal realist can accept overlapping worlds. So an object can exist in multiple possible worlds, even if the worlds are concrete objects like David Lewis assumes. Fictional characters, then, if they are possible people, are not world-bound. They can exist in multiple possible worlds. Even consistent with modal realism, according to Chris McDaniel. And then going to assume that he's right about that. So I'm going to assume that names are directly referential and that the reference exists in multiple possible worlds. Some people might have worries about how that's possible, because they might have worries about how it's even possible to refer to merely possible objects. That's a question known as the selection problem that has gained an enormous amount of literature. I have written about that myself in a 2019 paper in Topoi, where I argue that no, the selection problem is not a genuine problem. Referring to merely possible objects is really not an issue. And the basic idea there is that Arthur Conan Doyle, when he started writing the Holmes novels, he managed to refer to Holmes by just stipulating that Holmes refers to a fictional character. He doesn't even need to do that explicitly. He tacitly made that kind of stipulation early on. And part of the reason why I think that move works is because, at least if you're not a strong essentialist, which I just said we shouldn't be, then Sherlock Holmes could be any possible object. So what Doyle did at the start of the stories was to just stipulately attaching the name Holmes to an arbitrarily selected possible object. And I also argue that Conan Doyle's implicit decision to write about a fictional character suffice that some arbitrary, merely possible object is assigned to the name. That's something I've argued for elsewhere, so that's not what I'm going to argue for there. Again, if people have questions about whether this can possibly work, I can take that in the question session. But okay, what I've said thus far is supposed to sort of bolster the idea of we can have direct reference to merely possible objects. And I'm unsure about how metaphysically robust that kind of theory needs to be. But I want to mention that there is an alternative here that I'm kind of very sympathetic to, but haven't thought through in sufficient detail to really commit to. And that's presuppositionalism or variabilism about proper names. I don't know if you are familiar with that idea, but it's an idea that has sort of picked up a lot of steam over the last decade. Sam Cumming, Brian Pickle, Anders Skaubye, Garcia Carpintero. I think Yagisawa was the first one to defend that kind of view in the 90s. So basically, according to this sort of view, the semantic content of a proper name is the content of a bound variable. And in that kind, what so the story we can tell here is that so by introducing Sherlock Holmes, Doyle introduces a sort of antecedent kind of a phrase like, there is a purely fictional character called Sherlock Holmes. And then later utterances of Holmes are interpreted as variable statements containing variables bound by that initial statement. In that case, what you really get then is we get proper names will still be rigid designators. This whatever satisfies each occurrence of a variable bound by the initial antecedent will be the same that is supposed to satisfy the variable in the introduction. So basically, the idea is that Sherlock Holmes is an anaphoric pronoun of sorts, what linguists call a discourse reference. And it's, but it doesn't refer. It gets its sort of interpretation constrained by the initial act of introducing the name into language. What you get is, in effect, a system that basically mirrors a direct reference view. But what Doyle does is not really referring to a possible object. we don't need an actual referent for the term to be meaningful. But we get sameness of reference, at least sort of intentional identity. Doyle and a literary scholar down the road are talking about the same insofar as they would be talking about the same object if there was one that I know them was talking about, basically. So producers, so people who read or interpret or talk about fiction down the road, like me or you, we're basically picking up a variable still bound by the antecedent introduced by Conan Doyle. We're not descriptivists. The way we pick up this antecedent might be by just being in the right sort of causal relationship to the antecedent. But what you basically get is a system where each sentence of fiction is interpreted as each singular proposition expressed by a sentence in fiction is interpreted as containing a variable bound by the initial antecedent. What it gives us are singular propositions. It gives us their modality. It gives us intentional identity, but it doesn't necessarily commit us to there being a reference. In that case, I could also possibly avoid any commitment to modal realism. At least in the Lewis sense. I could maybe defend an ersatzist theory about possible worlds, maybe even a fictionalist theory. So I just wanted to throw out that there is an alternative view here that might be able to work for me, but which I haven't worked through in enough detail. So I'm going to just talk as if Sherlock Holmes is a directly referential term and possible worlds are real concrete objects. But okay. The idea here, when he introduced Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle selected a merely possible object from the space of possible objects from what Greg Curry called the sort of fictional plenitude, an object to serve as referent for Holmes among numerous potential candidates. At the start, well, just add two, that if there's a possible object like this, then it's an object that exists in multiple possible worlds. In different possible worlds, this object instantiates different properties. In some worlds, this object that Doyle selected as a referent for Holmes, in some worlds is a detective, in other worlds is a barrel maker, in other worlds is a future space traveler, whatever. It exists in multiple possible worlds. And at the beginning of telling the story, this set of world is completely open. So all the worlds where this object exists are in the world. So to emphasize, what I'm saying that when Lewis started writing the story, he didn't select a possible world. He selected a possible individual that existed in numerous possible worlds, where this individual is essentially different properties. And by having that as a starting point, what I can do is to incorporate this model I'm trying to draw into a very familiar model of information exchange from Stolnaker. So according to that kind of model, the content of the contribution to a discourse, so when you utter something, when you state something, assert something, that what you in practice do is you remove worlds incompatible with the statement from the context set of worlds. So basically, at the outset of any kind of discourse, according to Stolnaker, there is a set of worlds that is consistent with all the presuppositions and so on the participants are engaged in. And when they go through the discourse or the exchange, what they do is basically shrinking this context set by removing the worlds that are incompatible with the contribution. So basically, if I inform someone that I went to the bar yesterday, then I'm removing all the I didn't go to the bar worlds from the context set and shrinking. So information gain is basically narrowing down the set of possible worlds compatible with what's said in the discourse. And that's basically the model I wanted to give for fictional talk 2. So At the beginning, when Doyle started writing about Holmes, he started with sort of like this widest possible world. He had identified an object as Holmes, but that object exists in multiple possible worlds. Then he starts to add properties to Holmes. So Holmes is a detective. He meets Watson, and start to solving crimes and whatnot. And by doing so, Doyle removes worlds from the context set. Now, of course, by intending to engage in fiction, the actual world is not part of the worlds that form this context set. So that's basically what I think distinguishes fiction from ordinary discussions. There is no intention of having the actual world as one of the possible worlds in the context of a discourse. But having determined the context set, Doyle proceeded over the course of the stories to eliminate worlds from the set, starting with the worlds where Holmes is not a detective, didn't live in London, and so on and so forth. When he introduced new characters, he needed to make new reference selections. Eligible possible candidates for being referenced are, well, objects that populate scenarios in which Holmes could have taken part. So basically, for any eligible Moriarty candidate, there must, at the outset of telling the stories, be a world in which Holmes interacts with that candidate as it satisfies the description associated with Moriarty, which could be any possible individual among those not selected yet for other roles. And then you go on and cut down the context set. It's really hard to give the sort of formal details here without having sort of a whiteboard, but basically, you create a context set around Holmes and you narrow it down. Yeah. Now, in fiction, we do encounter problems with this kind of model. So one example I think I mentioned in a paper before is, so are you familiar with Fight Club? Chuck Palahniuk's book and the movie. So let's assume that at the outset, Palahniuk hadn't decided that Tyler Durden and the narrator were the same character. That's something he decided later on. Well, given that identity is necessary, that doesn't really work on this sort of conversation model. So there we need some kind of repair. But that seems plausible to me. I mean, if you suddenly make such a momentous discovery that, hey, we can make the narrator and Tyler Durden to be the same person, then yeah, that requires reinterpreting everything else that's gone on before. So it kind of requires going through the whole story again and, telling it anew to yourself. So sometimes we have to make really momentous repairs. We can't just sort of proceed in the natural manner of cutting through worlds, but we need to backtrack and make new interpretations. But that seems fine to me. But again, if it were sort of radical essentialists, this would be problematic because if Holmes' height was an essential property of him, then whenever Doyle decided to change his height, he wouldn't just need to cut out the worlds where Holmes is less than 5 feet or higher, taller than 7 feet. He would actually need to reinterpret everything else he'd done and start with a completely new context set. That would be very inelegant. So yeah, the model, in order to work, kind of assumes that we're not essentialist about too much. So I don't know how much you followed from that. So we have this context set that works as a sort of the context set for a fiction. And I mean, the way I presented it, it doesn't follow how Conan Doyle actually wrote the stories or presented them, but it's somewhat idealized. I'm also really unsure whether we should take the updating of the context set to be reflecting Doyle's creative process, the way he thought through the story or the way he actually wrote it. I don't know what way to go about that. Let's assume it's the way he wrote it. I don't know what really hinges on it. I'm gonna skip this because I'm spent too much time already. But basically, my point here is that one, there should be a difference between engaging in fictional talk and engaging in counterfactual talk. But that distinction shouldn't be semantic, and it should definitely not be metaphysical. It's due to sort of pragmatic factors influencing how we update context sets, but I'm not going to say more about that. Okay, so now I'm going to come to how I understand truth in fiction. So according to Lewis, P is true in worlds where F is told as known fact. If you remember the definition I gave initially, I have dropped that known fact part. A sentence as in fiction is true in worlds where F and false, then S is, and then P is the case. I could go back to the first one. In fiction F, S is true if and only if in the relevant possible worlds reflecting F, S. The reason Lewis wanted to restrict it to a world where the fiction is told as known fact was basically to rule out the possibility of fictions matching actual events and thus being true, sort of by coincidence. I don't think I will need that, both because I think Doyle's intention to talk about the purely possible object rules that out. He couldn't have referred to an actual object. That's kind of one of the restrictions I think he made initially. And since he refers to a merely possible object, we don't need the qualifier told as known fact. Also, I'm not really sure what people's intuitions are about this sort of Lewisian point. Would it really matter whether the events that took place in the fiction happen to be true in the actual world? I'm not entirely sure. But okay, so according to the model I'm trying to describe, at the beginning, Holmes was maximally incomplete. And Doyle created him by sort of eliminating possible ways Holmes could have been. And he fleshes Holmes out in some detail, but even at the end of the stories, Holmes remains incomplete. For instance, we're never told what blood type Holmes has. And we don't want it to really be the case that Holmes has a particular blood type. That is true in the fiction that Holmes has blood type A, say. Holmes' blood type is never settled. Yet it is, of course, the case that in all possible worlds where Holmes exists, he does have a specific blood type. One thing I reject and take as to be sort of, I can't really wrap my head around what it means, but Ed Salter defended a view like that the fictional characters are metaphysically incomplete beings. Now, he's a Menongian, so there's a lot of other metaphysical baggage going in there. But I do take that to be, well, first of all, relatively incomprehensible, and also to be implausible for kind of obvious reasons, because there are traits that are attributed to Holmes in the stories that implies that he is kind of metaphysically complete. He is described as an otherwise normal human being. Not in those exact words, I don't remember exactly where I have it from. But there are at least descriptions of Holmes in the Holmes stories that entail that he is a regular human being, that is, that he is complete. Ordinary human beings have a specific blood type. So in order to be a normal human being, if it's true, and it is true, Holmes should have a particular blood type. And the solution I want to go for, and I'm going to describe it in a second, is, well, that just means that there is no uniquely closest world. Incompleteness has to mean that different possible worlds where Sherlock Holmes has different blood types need to be equally good truth makers for the story, insofar as they agree on everything that's actually stated or entailed by the story. of course, I have to open up for the possibility that maybe it is entailed by something attributed to Holmes in the fiction that he actually has a specific blood type. As far as I know, you can't really tell by people's behavior or physiology whether they have a particular blood type. But if that should be the case, that some property attributed to Holmes, explicitly attributed to Holmes in the stories, does entail that he has a particular blood type, then it should be true in the fiction that Holmes has this blood type. But assuming that there isn't, there should be multiple worlds that are equally good truth makers for the Holmes stories. Worlds in which he has different blood types. But the worlds that are equally good truth makers from the Holmes stories should also agree on everything explicitly stated in the stories or entailed by the story, including Holmes being a detective, but also things like not having 3 hands, which you'd think is implied by things explicitly stated in the story. And presumably also a lot of things not explicitly asserted in the stories, but not incompatible with them, such as the laws of nature or Edinburgh being to the north of London, and so on. But okay, let me get to the how I look at it. So let W here be the set of possible worlds, equidistant worlds, the worlds that are equally far away from the actual world, and also represent the fiction F. So W here is supposed to be the closest possible worlds in which everything in that is recounted in the fiction actually takes place. For a sentence to be true in fiction, then, is for P to be true in all worlds in that set. And presumably there are way more than one world in that set, because there are worlds both in which Holmes has blood type A and in which he has blood type B, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of different possible worlds in the set. A claim in fiction is true if it's true in all of them, and it's false if it's true in none of them. So Holmes is a future space traveler is presumably false in all these possible worlds. A sentence is neither true nor false in the fiction if it's true in some worlds, but not others. So given that simple definition, we get the results we want. Holmes is a detective is true in the fiction. Holmes is 5 feet tall is false. Holmes has blood type A is neither, unless, again, it is unknown to us at present, entailed by some other property ascribed to Holmes in the stories. Given that definition, truth in fiction is, formally speaking at least, just a standard box operator that ranges over the restricted set of worlds where the events of the fiction takes place. And P is false in the fiction is equivalent to it's true in the fiction F that not P. On the other hand, Holmes has blood type A is true in some but not all of the worlds, means that it's consistent with the fiction. And if we wanted to, we could define a consistent with the fiction operator from true in fiction the way we define the possibility operator from the necessity operator in model logic. One thing that is true in the fiction is that Holmes either has blood type A or he hasn't. So all tautologies will necessarily be true in fiction, given this definition. That consequence has, for some reason, been taken to be problematic. So Proudfoot, in her 2005 article, hammers on this point that this is unproblematic. I'm not entirely sure precisely why she thinks it's problematic, but it seems to me that the objection is based on a kind of confusion. I would naturally think that given that the connectives mean the same in fiction as they do in ordinary speech, then all tautologies should be true in the fiction. The fact that Holmes either has blood type A or he doesn't, that is true in the fiction, would be problematic if it meant that it's either true in fiction that he has blood type A or it's true in fiction that he doesn't have blood type A. that would be a problem. But the way I've defined the truth in fiction operator, that doesn't follow. True in fiction doesn't distribute over a disjunction like that. It doesn't follow from the fact that it's true that in the fiction that Holmes either has blood type A or he doesn't. That it's true in fiction that he has blood type A, or it's true in fiction that he doesn't have blood type A. And for those sufficiently familiar with modal logic, that should be relatively obvious because it doesn't follow. The box operator doesn't distribute over the disjunction in any normal modal logic. Okay, so that's basically my formal definition of true in fiction. If you accept something like that, it does have some consequences. What is true in fiction evolves over the course of creating a story. When the author adds information to the stories, the context set of the story shrinks, and the information previously consistent with the fiction becomes true in fiction. And one of the offshoots of that, which I find somewhat interesting and which I think I can have a lot of fun with, is our account has no problem explaining or predicting continuity across books involving the same universe or other authors picking up where Doyle left off. Inventing new stories involving the numerically same characters and settings, for instance, is something we can account for. Because, like I said, in the worlds constituting the set of worlds making over which truth and fiction is defined, Holmes has different properties, the ones that aren't specified in the story. So, for instance, he has a different blood type, but it's the same object. It's the same Holmes, numerically the same Holmes that exist in all these worlds and have different blood types. And likewise, I don't think I have any problems with saying things like, I don't know if you've seen the Benedict Cumberbatch series, Sherlock Holmes, where it takes place in modern day London and so on. I'm thinking about the right series, am I not? Is that the same Sherlock Holmes, numerically the same Sherlock Holmes? Sure. It's the same character in a different set of possible worlds. Mad Max is a tricky case, though. If you know the Mad Max series, it's kind of unclear whether Mad Max is the same individual in the different Mad Max movies. It would be kind of crazy if he was. Another one, it's Wozzeck, however. That's a character that occurs in several different but similar stories. Georg Büchner was the author of the original Wozzeck. Then Alban Berg wrote a famous opera on Wozzeck. At the same time, another German composer, Manfred Gurlitt, wrote an opera also on Wozzeck, where Wozzeck is kind of different. But I think it's plausible to say that, look, no, this is the very same character. But he has different properties in different stories. So the different stories take place in different sets of possible worlds, but concerning the same character. And there are plenty of fun cases to discuss here. The new Tolkien, Amazon Prime Tolkien movie, does it take place in, well, it does not take place in the same world as Tolkien's original stories. I would at least claim, but I have some stakes here. Might be new stories with the same characters. Different fictions develop from the same kind of starting points. We have the issue of fan fiction, continuations or additions to the stories. I think it's reasonable to think of the fan fiction as literally concerning the same stories. Whether we count them as true it's true in the fictions written by the fan, but then of course, you get discussion issues about what counts as the official canon and stuff. What's supposed to be true. I guess authors of fan fiction get the feeling that the stories aren't really true because they're thinking what was true in the official, canonically sanctioned universe, or what it might be. So there's a lot of Harry Potter fan fiction, for instance, and it tends to be a bit racy.
Excuse me, Fredrik, we're at 50 minutes, okay?
Okay, yeah. Right, I'm gonna do some things here a little bit briefly because now I just sort of kind of sketched the model and not really got into the fun part. But yeah, I'm actually gonna skip this part about the. I want to distinguish between the context set and the true and fiction set. That's adding a layer of complication, but I can discuss the remaining issues without going through that complication. So I think I'm going to just do that. But one thing that we do need to be aware of, though, is when we interpret fiction, we do import stuff, and we can't really help it. One thing is things like, where is Edinburgh located relative to London? Well, we naturally assume that Edinburgh is to the north of London, even if that is never explicitly stated in the Holmes stories. I'm not sure whether it is or not. But there's a lot of other things going on between the lines, right? When we interpret characters' motivations, we're adding usually a lot of stuff that's not really there in the stories, and we're doing so by importing stuff about what's plausible about the actual world. And you agree with me there? And it's kind of interesting to note because I mean, what would be an example? Vasek, again, he was driven to do what he did because of the pressures from society or something like that. That's something that's never explicitly stated in the source. He just follows sort of what happens to Vasek. That's an inference you need to make, but it's kind of a contingent inference given what's explicitly there. Or to take one that's close to mind, in the Elder Edda, Odin is supposed to give his eye to achieve full wisdom. But that motivation is never explicitly stated. At that point in the stories, we follow Mimir's point of view. So it's just inferred that that's why he gives his eye. But it seems to be a legitimate inference. It seems to be straightforward to say that it's true, according to the fiction, that Odin gave his eye to gain wisdom. The reason I wanted to distinguish the context set from the set of that provided the truth and fiction is because, of course, the author of a fiction can then go on to sort of change things around. The author can suddenly decide that Greenland doesn't exist in fiction, and that seems to be fine. So that's why I wanted to add two layers here, but I think it's possible to say what I want to say now without having to do that. But I do claim that what is true in fiction needs to be constrained by some kind of things we import. And I think that's kind of an important point because fan theories about fiction, look, we might think it's kind of geeky to be engaged in fan theories about, you know, Lord of the Rings or Star Wars or what have you. But it seems to make sense. It seems to be driving for something. And if I'm right, I'm going to defend the fan theories. They might actually be getting at the truth if they're doing things properly. And one way in which we would ensure that some of those speculations might be hitting on the truth is by saying, as I suggested initially, that what constitutes truth in the fiction are the closest possible worlds. The worlds that determine truth and fiction are those that are, on the whole, closest to the actual world. Now, closeness can be incorporated in different ways. Lewis suggests relativizing truth and fiction to the beliefs prevalent in an author's community, rather than just the worlds that are, in fact, closest. I don't think that's the right move. I'm reluctant to do that for several reasons, really. One thing is, I do think it's reasonable to say that fiction loses value for us when we discover that it relies on false premises. A couple of years ago, there was this internet phenomenon. Lots of people were discussing the Goldilocks story. You know the Goldilocks story. Goldilocks comes to the house of the three bears and discover that. So she goes in and then she tastes the porridge in the biggest bowl. That one is too hot. Then she tasted the porridge in the middle bowl. That one is too cold. And then she tastes porridge in the smallest bowl. And that's just right. And that's the sort of the Goldilocks zone. That's where the expression comes from. But of course, as commentators, we're really annoyed by that this violates the law of thermodynamics. There is no way that the middle bowl can be colder than the smallest bowl. And that's kind of a worry. Now, it might seem silly, but I do think that worry sort of captures something real here. That's the kind of errors or oversights that do actually concern us. And of course, it's also interesting that we're concerned about that. We're not concerned about the fact that the bears make porridge in the first place and then go for a walk. That's fine. Because that's part of the sort of explicit assumptions that the fiction operates under. But the bowls, that's unacceptable. Another familiar case here is, so in one of the Holmes stories, because I've been using Holmes, the solution to a murder is that a swamp adder climbed down a rope. Now, this is an example that's been much used in literature, and I have to admit I haven't read the relevant book, so I don't really know the details. Here, the problem is supposed to be that, well, that species of swamp adder, which is clearly described in the book, that one can't climb. And that makes the solution to the murder mystery impossible. What's a little bit curious is that swamp adder is often talked about as being an objection to the possible worlds analysis, because ostensibly in the closest world where the scenario takes place, Holmes would be wrong. And that's a problem because Holmes should be right, because according to the story, he obviously is right. But that, I think, is the wrong kind of objection. It's not that if you import the actual facts from the actual world, then Holmes is wrong. Rather, Holmes was right, because that's kind of explicitly stated in the fiction. So what's the case here is that according to possibilism, the world is located much farther away than we initially thought, because we have to change all sorts of facts about biology. You could do that and get a coherent interpretation of the fiction. This is a world in which it was a swamp adder climbing on the rope, and it's not possible. So it's not actually what swamp adders do. So it's a really far away world where swamp adders could actually do this kind of thing. But what I do think a correct account of truth in fiction should capture is that we're troubled by this passage. Something went wrong here. The fiction doesn't really work. And the reason I think we think that is that we really want to make the world as close and realistic as possible. But according to what's actually stated there, that's not possible. The world has to be really far away. And that's not really anything we'd like to do. And one reason, of course, to want genuine closeness rather than beliefs prevalent in an author's community is, well, if it's the beliefs that are prevalent in the author's community, that would salvage the Holmes story in the sense that, according to what people believed at the time it was written, they didn't know about swamp adders and rope climbing abilities. But it would also mean that, according to all 19th century novels, God would exist and women would be inferior to men, because those would be beliefs prevalent in the communities at that time. And I don't think that should be the case. I don't think those are facts we should import when we interpret the fiction. Rather, we should import as much as possible what's actually correct, and admit that we might be wrong about the interpretation, because what's actually getting imported might be things we don't know about. And if the novel explicitly, or sort of, if it's central to the storyline that women are indeed inferior to men, then that's a problem with the story. Not just, it doesn't just make the story morally bad, it makes it not work as a fiction because it relies on a false assumption. That said, possibilism is not necessarily wedded to closeness being the right measure here. We could restrict the context sets to the worlds that are most aesthetically pleasing. I don't know what that would look like. We could restrict it by genre conventions, and I think we sometimes do. I guess I'm running out of time here. Okay, I'll just finish this and then say what I was gonna say. Because I just read a great example about how our interpretation of fiction is constrained by genre conventions. A Tale Dark and Grim. That's now a Netflix animated series for kids, but it was originally in books, and those books are great because they really exploit the genre convention associated with fairy tales. And it sort of lulls you along to go along with the premises, and then the author, the narrator, breaks in and comments on, "Hey, no, notice how crazy what's going on here. You just accepted this? What on earth? This is insane." But it sort of really points out how we just expect certain things to happen because we're sort of attuned to the genre conventions about, what happens when you go to hell, or how kids behave in relation to grown-ups, and so on and so forth. So I guess it is correct. In order to measure truth in fiction, we also need to take into account genre conventions. And now, of course, I wanted to begin by discussing the problematic cases. What happens when we import things we didn't want to import? What happens when we encounter fictions that are non-literal or contains open holes and variable interpretations? What happens with contradictory fictions? And I have some stories to tell there, but I guess since I was given these 2 hours or this 1 hour, I should stop it there, and then people can rather ask me about that in the question session. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks, Fredrik, for the great talk. It was excellent. So we can start the questions. Do we have questions?
I guess there aren't that many.
Well, we have 2 questions. Meryl, please go ahead.
Hello? Yeah.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So thanks a lot. That was indeed very, very interesting. So I actually have a lot of questions.
Good.
So first question relates to the discussion of Lewis. And so I have just a sort of general question, I guess. So how does your analysis really differ from Lewis's analysis? So you talk about that you don't want to talk about the uniquely closest world, but also that's not something that Lewis does, right? So in this part of the talk, where you talk about your solution about Holmes not having a particular blood type, so that is actually how I interpreted Lewis's account. So
basically the difference. And when you asked that, I was just wondering, is the most striking deviation from Lewis how I could talk about the stuff I didn't get to talk about. But the most striking one is presumably the idea of trying to combine this with a direct reference view, where because Lewis gets into a lot of trouble over this having to go supervaluationist, for instance, because one of the problems he encounters are concern things like, well, so it isn't Holmes who has his different blood types, it's rather his counterparts of Holmes that has his blood types. So in a sense, it's not really indeterminate. All right, so I'm just trying to figure out how the supervaluationist move works for Lewis. Right. I need some more time to think about that. But no, what I was trying to do, at least, to give the main difference is to try to give a smoother interpretation of what truth and fiction involves, and in a way that gives us some more resources. One thing that I try to explain at the end here is how you can talk about or have genuine discussions about whether, say, something is a continuation of the fiction, whether it's the same fictional character, and whether you then can import things from previous versions, like in Lord of the Rings, or a better example with the Sherlock Holmes in the updated series. I think it makes perfect sense to think of it as the same character, and basically, I want the propositions to be singular. Lewis cannot achieve this. Whether the upshot, the outcome, is a model that really differs so vastly from Lewis. I mean, I guess Lewis wants to capture some of the same points, though I guess a lot of people would reject Lewis's account because it relies on the counterpart theory and it relies on descriptivism. So maybe you can interpret what I'm doing as, okay, so what would it look like if you didn't commit yourself to those things? What if you did commit yourself to direct references to singular propositions? Could you then still get a version of truth and fiction? And I think you can, and I think you can get a very plausible version of truth and fiction that does resemble Lewis. Is it susceptible to the same kind of objections? I mean, a lot of the objections concerns precisely things related to Lewis's descriptivism. Beyond that, I have to think about what I said. There are some things in the things I didn't get to about how I get to solve certain issues that have been raised against the possible world analysis that does indeed differ from Lewis. Right. But yeah, given what I said, I'm not sure, at least I don't differ that much in spirit from Lewis's account. That would maybe be a good thing. Yeah, give me a moment to think further about that. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, not now, right?
I'll try to do it, but I mean, just sitting here and staring in and thinking, you know.
Sure.
So let's take some other questions as we go along.
Sure, Italo.
All right, thank you very much, Fredrik. It was an excellent presentation. I was really looking forward to your presentation, so I'm happy that we had the chance to have you here at the Colloquium. I also have a lot of questions. I mean, I'm curious to know what the author is really doing when he is writing a story. Is he or she creating something or not? And I know that you said back then in your presentation that you were not trying to tackle this problem. So I'm going to try to focus on your theory of truth and fiction. And there are two things that
I could though answer the creationist thing though, if you wanted me to, because this is sort of an interesting kind of issue. It's sort of a common objection to possibilism and also certain other views that, you know, it's inconsistent with the idea that in a sense, it's inconsistent, at least, with the idea that authors create their fictional characters, because in a sense, they're already there to be discovered. I guess, to me, it depends a little bit on how you look at it, right? Because you say, well, in a sense, Conan Doyle here didn't really create something out of nothing. Fair enough. He didn't bring anything new into being. Fair enough, but that's a good thing, right? That's one of the problems with, say, abstract artifact theories. They do account for the author creating things, but he also committed to bringing things into being. And but I mean, what's the difference between creation and discovering possibilities? I mean, you have this apocryphal story about Michelangelo, right? He said, how did he put it? It's not like I create a statue. The statue is already there in the rock. I just chisel away the superfluous parts. And in a sense, yeah, that sounds to me a completely legitimate way of describing what Michelangelo was doing. He realized a possible object from the block of stone. Of course, what makes it creative, and that's the thing that Michelangelo didn't say, is that he chose which of the very many possible objects he would realize. So that's kind of how I would account for Doyle's creativity too. I mean, he chose what story he wanted to realize. That's creativity. He chose them out of an infinite number of possible stories. If that's creation enough, I guess it is, because creation in any other sense raises the problem of bringing things into being. So yeah, I think I would respond to the creationist worry along those lines at least. But yeah, now it was your real question.
I see. Just a follow-up to the question I didn't raise.
Yeah.
But do you think that there's a difference between thinking about possibilities and writing them down and making them part of our culture and of our ordinary talk and everything? Do you think there's a difference between these two things, or in a sense they are both us thinking about all these possibilities?
In a sense, they're different in a sense and possibly not different in another. I don't think they're... So when it comes to what do you think about the propositions and so on, semantically, there is no difference. If you tell a story to yourself, the world's created to you by your dreams and so on. And I guess it's weird to say that semantically speaking there. True in dreams might be iffy. But suppose you just sort of tell a story to yourself, or you imagine a story to yourself. I mean, I suppose that when you imagine a story to yourself, your imagination has a certain propositional structure. And in that sense, it has truth conditions, and there are worlds in which that imaginary story took place. And there is something that is true in that story. So in that sense, I don't think there is a semantic difference between what you're doing and what Doyle is doing, and I don't think there's a metaphysical difference if you're committed to model realism in one case and you're in the other. But I do think, of course, there are lots of other kinds of differences, and those come from sort of socially imposed constraints. And I mean, there is a reason why I mentioned this about fan fictions and the establishment of a canon. You do that because you establish this canon because you want to control what's considered true in the fiction we're talking about. Now, for a person writing a fan fiction, there will still be things that are true in that person's fan fiction, but it wouldn't be true in the sort of canonical story. Basically, what the fan fiction writer does is, try to eliminate a couple of further worlds and end up with a different set of truth and fiction worlds. And they can do that. That truth and fiction will never gain any currency, but that's a pragmatic social kind of issue. So yeah, there are differences, but those concern social pragmatic factors, not really the semantics or the metaphysics. And that's kind of really also the kind of distinction I wanted to draw between counterfactual talk and fictional talk too. There is, of course, a difference, and there's a difference on the kind of felicity constraints you introduce to update your context sets. Talk a little bit about it formally, but I'm not going to do that. What's the difference between telling a fictional story and telling a lie? Well, there isn't a semantic difference. Part should someone like Predelli, who would be committed to there being a semantic difference. I wouldn't think there's a semantic difference. The difference comes exactly from this kind of conversation pragmatics, where when you lie to someone, you are sort of taking it for granted that you're talking about the actual world. And that you're giving information that narrows the context set down on the actual world. When you're telling a piece of fiction, you're kind of explicitly asserting to your audience that, no, that's not what I'm doing. The actual world is not part of this. But that difference is a pragmatic one. It's not a semantic one, and it's not a difference in the nature of possible worlds or anything like that. Did I answer your question now? I think maybe I did, but I'm not completely sure.
Sure. So I'll be really fast because I don't want us to run out of time. And I know that Jesse wants to raise a question. But my main question regards your theory on truth and fiction. I have your slides here on YouTube, actually. I just paused it.
Yeah.
And my first question regards the need for us to have tautologies in fiction. And here I read, Holmes either has blood type A or he doesn't. Is true in fiction. Why should we need to rely on tautologies in fiction? And of course, I know that you are already anticipating the example I'm going to use, which is Watson's war wound. I think in A Study in Scarlet, Holmes says that Watson has an injury in his left arm. And then in The Sign of 4, I guess, Watson says that the injury is in his leg. Of course, I could say that maybe Watson or Holmes not a reliable narrator or character or anything, but let's just assume that Watson could have at the same time a wound in the left arm and in the leg. Maybe I could like break this tautology. Is this necessary for us to preserve that? And the second question is related to that one, in the sense that you say that P is true in F, in fiction, if and only if P is true in all words W that contains the major W. So Holmes' detective is thus true in fiction. Does that mean that Holmes is necessarily a detective for Holmes to be Holmes? And if that is the case, aren't we relying on essentialism here? And these are my two main questions. And once again, thank you very much for your excellent presentation.
Great questions. I'll take them in order. Or should I take them in reverse order? I might actually want to take them in the somewhat reverse order, because I think the first one is somewhat shorter. Holmes, detective. Holmes is a detective. That's true in fiction. It's not necessarily true. And that's, of course, a difference between me and Kripke and Lewis and so on, too. I don't want it to be true. Holmes could have failed to become a detective. He could have been a barrel maker. He is in some worlds in which he exists. Those worlds are not part of Doyle's context set, and are not part of the worlds that constitute the truth and fiction. But he's a normal person, and insofar as normal persons could have had different traits than Holmes could too. So when you're asking, so even in the fiction, one could have said something like, oh, you know, Holmes become a detective, but he could have become a trader instead. Then it would be true in the fiction that Holmes is a detective, but could have become a trader. And what that really means is that, well, from the worlds that go into the truth-making set, there need to be an accessible possible world in which he became a trader instead of a detective. That world is not part of the world that constitutes the world in fiction, but it's got to be accessible from it. So that, because this is one thing about counterfactuals, right? We can use possible worlds to analyze them. I like that because I like possible worlds. But counterfactual claims are ultimately really about the actual world. When you're saying that, you know, if I hadn't lit the match, the fire wouldn't have lit. You're saying something about the actual world by kind of expressing that given the worlds that are accessible from the actual world, if the world in the worlds where the match hadn't been lit, the fire wouldn't have burnt. So yeah, I would say that Holmes is not necessarily a detective, not at all, and hopefully he's not necessarily very much, because Doyle could have let him meet a wizard that transformed into a cat, and that would be fine. Yeah, so that's that, and yeah, also emphasizing the point that this is a point where I'm definitely allowing myself to have resources that Lewis couldn't have. By being a descriptivist, it would be really hard to figure out how you could have characters that, you know, he was identified by being a detective, so there is no world in which he couldn't be. As for tautologies, so like P or not P and those kinds of tautologies, it's not necessarily a particular wish for me to have them true, but I'm kind of forced to, because these are possible worlds, and you know, there is no possible world in which P or not P is false. So what I was kind of reacting to were the people who thought that this was problematic, and that's something I didn't think was the case. And I think when you define truth and fiction the way I do, which Lewis never explicitly does, I'm sort of still being worried by the previous question here, then it becomes obvious that no, that problem won't arise. There is no, or it becomes obvious that there is no recognizable problem here. I need to commit myself to P or not P being true in the fiction. So it is true in Virgil's Aeneid that in 1939 Hitler invades Poland, or he doesn't. So the tautology there, either he does or he doesn't, would come up. Okay, there's a reference in there, so that might not have, but fair enough. Something like that would come out. But what wouldn't be the case is that it's either true in fiction that Hitler will invade Poland, or true in fiction that he won't. So I don't have to choose. I can have both sets of worlds in the context set. And I think that's fine. Now, with regard to Watson's war wound, because this is something I hope that I would actually be able to say something about. So one of the issues that are often raised against as possible world analysis is the problem of inconsistent fictions. Now, one thing that is curious about inconsistent fictions is that inconsistent fictions are incredibly rare. You have priests, Sylvan Box example, but usually what's counted as inconsistent fictions are fiction that where there are plot discontinuities and stuff like that. So take Watson's war wound. In one story it's on his shoulder, in another story it's on his leg. Now there are possible worlds where war wounds move around. So there is a possible world in which Watson had a war wound that moved. Now the question back is, that's not how you want to interpret that story, right? We don't want it to be true in the story that Watson has war wounds that move around. But that's explicitly what Doyle commits himself to. But what I think we do is we engage in some kind of repair here. We want his story to be realistic. We want the worlds of the story to be closer to the actual one. So we try to explain it away in some way. If it's not possible, we sort of bracket that claim and keep it out. Maybe it was a misprint, something like that. It's basically, we're basically facing the same kind of situation we are in the Goldilocks case here. There's something that doesn't work, and that's a problem. And now this is sort of Lewis's solution too. So we define truth for maximally consistent subsets of the story. Or maybe, as I'm inclined to say, we just bracket away some of the claims, and maybe the author was mistaken. We could say maybe the narrator was mistaken, but there might not be a narrator here, but that's a sort of separate issue. Yeah, so in a sense, technically, I have no problem with that example because there are worlds where war wounds move around. But those are not the worlds we want to be the truth makers. But so in order for it to be an objection, you have to agree with me on that. And then I say, yeah, sure, we engage in repair. And that's fine. You've already kind of committed yourself to that solution to this issue. As for, I don't know if I'm going on for long here now, because I kind of wanted to say just a little bit about Sylvan's box too. I don't know if you're familiar with the story. So Graham Priest has this story about the box that both is and isn't there. Now that would be an example of a genuinely contradictory fiction. But I'm sort of inclined to bite a bullet and say that, no, he kind of failed to describe that object in the story. I'm not alone in doing that. And one way into that kind of conclusion is to notice some examples that Everett is using of purportedly contradictory fictions, which I take to be really problematic. I'm not going to go to the frick and frack thing because that requires a bit more setup. But he suggests sort of offhandedly a story in which identity is not symmetric. That will be an example of an inconsistent fiction. But then I kind of balk at that suggestion, because if you're trying to create a story in which identity is asymmetric, then what you're describing just isn't identity. I mean, it's a supervenience or something can be asymmetric. Identity just can't be. It would be a little bit like trying to write a story about a married bachelor. I mean, you can try to do that. You can use the word bachelor and you can say that the character is married, but you wouldn't still have written a story about a married bachelor. You just can't do that. That's not how our words work. You've made a mistake here. And I wonder if you could say, so my point is, I think in those kinds of examples, the intuitions are a bit on my side and saying that, nah, there's something that fails in these kind of cases. There are restrictions on what you can do. And then I'm suggesting that, well, maybe Sylvan's box should go down the same road. It seemed to the character in the story that it was a box that both was and wasn't there, but you know, he hasn't quite managed to write a story in which there is a box that both is and isn't there. It might look that way, but not really. Because I have to bite the bullet. So if there is genuine contradiction, then yeah, there is no world in which it's true.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I had more questions, of course, but I think the host is going to. Jesse, it's up to you. Yeah. But thank you very much, Fredrik. It was awesome.
So let's take the last question. Meryl?
Yeah, thanks. But I already asked the question.
Oh, your hand is still up. I think it's just that your hand hasn't been lowered.
No, but you can go ahead. I can ask. Okay. We can continue.
Yeah, I can also stay actually. Mm-hmm. Okay, so then I'll ask my second question. So some of my previous research was actually on Stalnaker's Common Ground framework and also fiction. Mm-hmm. And so you have this framework where you have a writer and he takes a context set or common ground, right, and updates that with fictional statements. And so I just wanted to, I don't know, either tell you or maybe you already know that, so this is something that has also been done in unofficial common ground accounts by Eckhart and Stocke and also done by Zucchi, and and I also use this sort of starting point in my dissertation. So I maybe you already know all this, but if not, I can send you a whole bunch of references.
Kind of cool, because I'm not really familiar with this. I want to point out that I suggested it also for fiction back in 2016, so I sort of have that one in. In print in some article, not fully developed, but no, that will be good. I didn't think much about it really. I just took it to be sort of okay. So if you have the direct reference view, then you can get out with this sort of vast set of worlds, and why not just use Stalnaker?
I don't think it's like, I mean, it's a sort of natural framework to take, but I just think that maybe that literature would contain some useful ideas. And in fact, one of the problems that pops up in that framework is something that also, spurred a question during your talk. So namely, you say that the writer, he starts out with context set, right, with common ground, and updates that with fictional statements. But then my question is whether you can say a bit more about what context set you basically start out with, right? So you said possible worlds in which, for instance, Sherlock Holmes exists. But so either the context set is enormous, right? To avoid that, when you update it with fictional statements, you're going to have an inconsistent context set, right? So that's one way to go. But then you get the question, okay, how then do we import implicit fictional truths, right? When and how do you then import fictional truths like London is in England and whatever, water is H2O into the context?
Good,
so this is just sort of general question that also pops up in this literature, and I'm wondering how you want to deal with it.
Yes, and I do think I have answers to that. I would love to look at literature, though. I sort of, when you mention it, it's sort of, I'm dimly aware that I've encountered some way, but you could very well send me links because I haven't paid sufficient attention. Now, I'm perfectly clear that I start with an enormous context set. And I want to, Doyle starts with a blank slate. Basically, he starts with, now he didn't start with Sherlock Holmes. I mean, the story starts, with London or something. So there's some restrictions before the selection is made. But it starts with an enormous context set. And it's very big, partially because I do think that at the outset, one character, but he has to interact with, so at the outset, I mean, it's got to be possible that he interacts with Moriarty, but at the outset, no one is selected for Moriarty. So all possible individuals can serve the role of Moriarty until that settles. It's hard to formulate in orally. I'll have to do it in print. But yeah, it's a gigantic context set. I assume that no restrictions whatsoever. And then you add them in. The question was, importing the implicit one. Yeah. So what I thought I was going to be able to say a little bit about is, and this is it's on the slide. I actually do want to make a distinction between the context set that represents the sort of stories and what makes it truth and fiction. Because I kind of don't want to have the import of closeness into the context set. I want it to be, this is very Baroque, but I kind of want to operate with two levels here. One thing is the context set where the author does whatever the author wants. And the other one is what defines truth and fiction, which is not entirely up to the author, but what he implicitly or explicitly invites us to assume about what is written. And it's we then who import those, it's not we, it's in the interpretation of what the author has written that the closeness comes in, the closeness restrictions and so on, and the genre convention, that kind of stuff. That makes it kind of inelegant, but I haven't thought that much about it. So if the literature has some kind of interesting points to be made around those kinds of approaches, then I would love to see it.
Well, maybe, can I just have a quick follow-up?
Yeah.
So one question that I have then is, so this context set, so in Stalnaker's framework also is used to guide speech, right? Common ground is used to guide speech. So I can say to you, I am going to the party because it's common ground between us that there is a party. But then if you have a novel and it starts with something like, there lived a guy and he lived in London and blah, blah, blah. And the context set is enormous. Then it doesn't contain any information about what London is, for instance. And then the question is, okay, so how then if the context set is indeed this enormous, then how can a reader interpret a statement like that?
Well, I assume that the assumption and so on gets projected once they're needed. So when you write, I went to the party, then okay, there is a party and so on gets sort of projected in and are also part of narrowing down the context set. But I still think that the context set is very huge. In order for us to interpret it, we have to bring in the extra kind of information in some way or other. Like I said, things about character motivations and stuff like that, which should be obvious but aren't explicitly stated in the stories. And I think that kind of gets brought in the interpretive project. Now, like I said, I haven't thought too much in detail about it, because the kind of intuition I wanted to have in here is, well, I mentioned the example about the author later on suddenly deciding, hey, Greenland doesn't exist, and it's completely consistent with what I've written thus far. So then you want to make the context set sort of to be kind of vast. And also you exploit this kind of dynamic when you, presumably when you have interesting plot twists. Well, the plot twists often work on, you've made your audience pull in assumptions that aren't really at work in the fiction, and which maybe should have been obvious from the beginning aren't at work in the fiction, but you didn't see that as a reader. I'm not sure I need this sort of Baroque 2 level model to incorporate that, but that seemed to me to be the sort of most natural road. So, and in that case, yeah, truth in fiction is determined. So the truth in fiction and the correct interpretation is determined by the facts of the real world. Now, that's of course something I try to be explicit about. It's not decided by what we think is the fact about the real world. It's decided by the facts. So that means that I end up with having to say that there is a correct and there is a wrong interpretation. There might be several equally correct ones because there are things that are indeterminate, but yeah, there could be a fact of the matter about certain events that take place that we wonder about. I don't know if that was an answer, but I would love for you to send me some further links, because it is a literature I admit I haven't kept completely on top of.
Okay, thanks. Do we have time for a last question, if I may? Yes, okay.
I have time at least.
Okay, so I can. So my question would be, what do you take to be the minimal definition of realism in fiction? Because I was reading your paper on how to pick out a dragon, and you mentioned Sainsbury definition, which refers to a sort of exportation inference, right? In fiction, if in fiction F N is G, then N is such that according to F it is G. So you have an export schema, right?
Yeah.
But what I think is that I could provide more or less 3 minimal definitions of realism. So one would be this one, would be, well, realist theory is one that validates the schema. A second one would be that sentences featuring the names of fictional objects express singular propositions. Would those two be equivalent? I don't know.
Probably not, given the suggestion of variableism that I suggested, but that's
yeah.
Okay.
And the third one would be that, well, proper names refer. Proper names, proper names of fictional objects refer. Yeah. So which one do you think would be the minimal and at the same time most inclusive definition of realism in fiction? One that would encompass possibilism and artifactualism and Meininganism under the same umbrella.
Yeah, so I maybe Sainsbury's perhaps, because I think that if you accept that names are directly referential, then it's really hard to avoid realism. Well, you can, of course, but then you need a lot of machinery and to do it. But I don't think if you're a descriptivist, it's much easier to avoid realism. But I do think a descriptivist could be a realist. I mean, Lewis is a prime example. So reference probably shouldn't be a necessary condition for realism. But the Sainsbury one seems like a reasonable definition of at least realism. That would be realism with fictional characters, at least. Now, so the question about what I commit myself to, it seems like I might commit myself to a pretty robust form of realism. I was mentioning this variablist option because it seemed to me to be a way out. It's tricky because you still want, because one thing is getting around the reference commitment. The other one is, well, when you talk about truth and fiction, aren't you then committing yourself that way to some kind of realism, even regardless of direct reference? But it's a bit unclear because it opens up options for possible worlds of properties and these kinds of things, and this is metaphysical topics that are not really my area of expertise. And it's also, it seems to me that if you go with a variablist kind or a presuppositionalist kind of view, then you can go fictionalist, like Stuart Brock does, and say, well, then let's just assume David Lewis and accept that the model for truth and fiction isn't really true, but it's, you know, it's true that according to the correct model of truth and fiction, then Sherlock Holmes as a detective is true. It will get sort of, but I do have a paper against fictionalism about fiction, where I argue that that move is, fictionalism about fiction is really bad. But it's primarily really bad if you accept direct reference. Then it doesn't work, because then you get a commitment to these objects already by the semantics. So that's why I thought that, well, if you go variablist, then maybe you could be a fictionalist about fictional character and about truth and fiction too. That seems a little bit strange, but you know, so it does, at least for many concrete possible worlds, trade-off here. Yeah, I'm not sure I properly answered your question though.
Oh, you did. Thank you. So do we have more questions? No. So I'd like to thank once again Professor Haraldsen for your talk, for your conference, for answering our questions. It was a great talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
And